I was in a stressful job. I was an overweight smoker. I was having like all of these kind of like early midlife crises issues. Then all of a sudden she says, "Hey, guess what? I've got brain cancer and it's probably terminal." It gave me that opportunity to put the brakes on and go, whoa, whoa, wait a second. Maybe you ought to reassess things.
My mom has stage 4 cancer in her bones and in her breast. My dad's disease was 15 years, he died of ALS. I made a podcast about death, seemed like the thing to do. And if you're sad by all of this, well, you're gonna die too. Hello, happy week to all, or sad week to y'all, depending on how we're feeling. How we feeling? Feeling a little low? Feeling like a little need for resilience? I just listened to an episode of Audrey Helps Actors called Resilience, and they had a nice interview about the power of resilience and about what that means to you. And they recommended some exercises about writing down 25 to 100 of your fears and then finding the patterns amongst your fears, and that really we all only have 2 or 3 main fears driving us. Or if anyone follows Enneagrams or knows what their Enneagram number is, it can be 1 through 9. We're all sort of mostly driven by one fear. I'm a 3, so my main fear is of failure. And I just found it really interesting. I was totally going down the Enneagram train. So if you want to know what your Enneagram is and want to find out what kind of fear you are motivated by, give Enneagrams a Google. I don't have like one book rec on it, but just in general, knowing your type, I think is interesting. It feels like astrology adjacent, only with some more information that I can understand fully. I'm like, oh, I understand that we are motivated by different things, specifically based on our personality types, as opposed to what is in the stars. Although I'm open to the stars, I just don't have as much information that makes me be like, yes, I get this. So that's my thought for the day. Been rehearsing my play, playing a borderline alcoholic and suicidal comedian, which has been very intense. More thoughts on that soon. But if you're in the Los Angeles area, it's entitled Blaze and it opens up in April. I look forward to sharing more with you about that and my thoughts around that. Now, for today's episode, gonna jump in. We are chatting with the author of Cycle of Lives, David Richman, who became a cyclist in his 30s. He was an overweight smoker that completely turned his life around and is now a passionate athlete and activist and talks about cycling. And I found it very interesting. I feel like when I think of people who are extremely athletic, there's these stereotypes associated with that. If they've been working out since they were 5, they were on high school varsity teams. And he's like, nope, was none of those things. And here he is today. He's an author, public speaker, philanthropist, and athlete whose mission is to form more meaningful human connections through storytelling. In David's book, Cycle of Lives, David shares the interconnected stories of people overcoming trauma and delves deeply into their emotional journeys with cancer. He continues to do Ironman triathlons and a wide range of endurance athletic events, having recently completed a solo 4,700-mile bike ride. He is married, lives in Southern Nevada, and has twins who are in college. Today, we discuss the loss of David's sister, who died of brain cancer in 2007. Thank you, David, for being here and for sharing your story. We got to speak several months back at this point about the loss of his sister and everything he has done in her honor since then and his experience with endurance athletics, as mentioned. I so appreciate you guys being here. And as always, shoot me a message on Instagram at DyingOfLaughterPodcast if there's certain kind of content that you would like to hear. And or if you'd like to share a story about grief or just about your life. Love chatting and voice memoing. Last but not least, stay tuned. I had my first meeting to design my first grief-related product. I'm sort of freaking out about it. I also don't know what the point of bringing that up right now is because it's going to take a long time, but something is in the works and it's exciting. Also, it's almost that time of year where it's my birthday / the same 2 days later, the day that my dad died. And I'm having a funeral-themed birthday. Lol. Ha ha. Ha, it's not funny. Okay, have a good day or a shitty one. And remember, YOLO, you only die once. Thank you so much, David, for being here. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about your book and your experience honoring your sister, and all the wonderful things you're doing athletically are so impressive. So I appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me. I'm one of those few guests that you have on that's not already a friend. You have a million friends.
Oh my gosh, I do not have a million friends, but you are now my friend. So if I did, you would be a million and one. Welcome. Wait, can you share what we were just talking about before about you're in Vegas and you just did a bike ride outside in what was the weather? What was the temperature?
Two. Yesterday I did one, it was 110, so I figured it was the same. It was pretty warm, but I'm training for an Ironman that's coming up in about 6 or 7 weeks, and Ironman training waits for no one. So you got to get your rides in when you can get your rides and your runs in. So yeah, what I do is it's crazy. I dip in the pool like with all my biking clothes on and then jump on my bike and go for a bike ride. So at least for the first few miles, I'm cool, you know?
Wow. Is that typical for you, riding in this kind of weather because of where you live?
Yeah. I mean, I prefer the heat. I'm a wimp when it comes to the cold, man. I hate the cold. So I'm less bothered by heat than I am bothered by cold. So it doesn't, it adds additional challenges. When it's 110 degrees out and you're running 2.5 hours, that's different challenges. But I prefer the heat than the cold.
That's fair. That is good to hear, seeing as where you are. I love that. And because you have participated in so many, would you say triathlons specifically? I know you've done so many things of everything. Is there a specific race that comes to mind where it was the hottest? Like this race was the hottest degree because it was 120. Can you tell us something about that?
I've done a lot of hot weather races. Probably the most insane hot weather race that I ever did was after my sister died. The year later, I did an event to raise money for her, the cancer center that took care of her. And we called it, I started doing for June, her name is June, for June and June events. And the first for June and June event was a 85-mile solo run in Mexico at the end of June.
Oh my
It
goodness.
was like in the 90s, 80 to 90% humidity, and I ran 22 and a half hours straight.
Okay, this just blows my mind because I cannot imagine a world where I ran more than 2 hours straight. And yet here you are doing 22 hours in this temperature. I mean, it's really incredible. I'm glad that you talk about this on podcasts and in your book because it's just, do you meet people all the time that are like, what, excuse me, what? How did you get to this place? Did you grow up running as a child and it just evolved from there?
Yeah, people do ask, or I might just be too self-centered and I just start talking about it. But no, definitely did not grow up doing that at all. In fact, I'm not going to bore you with too long an answer, but I grew up, I was a swimmer in high school, but really I wasn't very athletic at all. In fact, I was a very heavy swimmer. And I stopped doing anything athletic really. I mean, I did some like activities like snowboarding or wakeboarding or something like that, but I never did anything athletic until my late 30s. By that time, I was overweight. I was a smoker. I had like just a million different stresses in my life and just was as unhealthy as you could imagine. Somebody being unhealthy, not from disease or something, but just from lifestyle and lack of movement and self-created stress and all this other stuff. And so, yeah, I just started. Like, first run I ever went on was less than 2 minutes and I barely could handle it. I mean, I literally could barely handle it.
Wow, I'm just so impressed that you started in your late 30s. I think that's a really incredible sentiment for anyone listening who just assumes people like you started in childhood. Did you hear my assumption? I was like, "Were you 5?" And I love that your answer was no, I was not.
I definitely was not. In fact, literally, like I stopped smoking in February of the year that I stopped smoking in. By March, I did a 5K. By April, I did a triathlon. By July, I did a half Ironman. And by November, I did a full Ironman. So within a year. So and when anybody goes, oh, well, I want to train for a marathon, a couple of years from now, I'm like, that's great. I mean, I'm very, very excited for you. But certainly you could set a higher goal, right? I'm not saying you should, but you could, right? When people go, oh, I could never run 10 miles. I'm like, well, you could. Maybe you don't want to. Maybe you don't want to make the time for it. That's fine. But yeah, of course you could. It just matters if you want to.
I love that. And now we are all pressured into figuring out how we're going to do that in the next 10 days, 5 days, tonight. I could do it tonight. Might not, but I could. I mean, where I live in North Hollywood. It's hotter. It's funny. I just moved. I was in West Hollywood for 7 years and I moved over the hill. It's 20 minutes away. Completely different temperature, like significantly hotter. So
I grew up right around the corner from me. I grew up in Sherman Oaks and then in North Hollywood too. So
Oh, you did?
I know that area well.
Amazing. You absolutely do. Okay. Love that for us. We could talk about that for a long time, but I guess we won't. We'll just get to, other things. So can you talk a little bit more about your childhood and set the tone for listeners? Who did you grow up with? Where did you grow up? You just kind of mentioned. I'll let you talk about it again. And I know we're honoring your sister today, but I was also interested in you mentioning the loss of your father. So I'd love to hear more about the timeline.
Well, everybody has that interesting story. That's one of the fun things about listening to podcasts like yours and, being able to talk to people is once you give them a listen and you just take a moment to interact in a kind of a centered, meaningful way, you find out that people's lives are pretty interesting. Now, we just are living our lives, so our lives are not that interesting to us, but yeah, I guess, when you give it a minute, maybe it is. Mine was a little odd. When I was born, my mom was 21. My dad turned 60 that year. So,
wow. You get an audible wow from me from that, but keep going.
yeah, big age difference, right? So 38-year age difference.
Wow.
Yeah, I think 18 and 56 when they were married. So, and he was an old guy. Like I'm close to that age and I'm not that old, right? He was old. So when I was 10, 15, when I got up to my late teens, early 20s, he died when I was 22. But I was exceptionally aware of the fact that he was old. And it was a very frustrating thing for me because I didn't have any guidance on how to deal with that. I didn't have a general understanding on how to deal with it. And I was very resentful for the fact that he was kind of feeble and old and, kind of simple and, was definitely way past the prime of his life. A wonderful man, had done tremendous amount of things, but all of those were long before I was born. So I was kind of resentful about it. And then at the same time, I was dealing with a mom who frankly loved kids, except for hated her own kids, hated the fact that she had kids. And I think that, here she is in her early 20s, realizing that she's married to somebody that's very old and not doing well health-wise, and she's stuck with two young kids when she's very young. So, on the one hand, I couldn't have turned to her because she really didn't like kids, and I couldn't turn to him because he didn't know how to deal with kids. So it was just me and my sister. So when I finally took the time, I know you've talked about this a lot, right? About like when to grieve. Is it the first few years? Is it within 5 years? Is it 20 years later, 30 years later, whatever? When I first started to kind of deal with the emotions behind losing my sister, it was that thought of shit, she's the only one that knows me as a kid, really. And we had those collective experiences together. So although it's, you lose that, you lose the person that knows you. That's how I grew up.
Well, thank you for sharing more about your backstory. I mean, I really resonate when you say we're living our lives, so they're not that interesting to us, but when you talk to other people, they are so interesting. That's so true. And it's an interesting anecdote about your parents' age gap. Certainly age gaps are common, but that is significant. Mine were 12, maybe 13 years apart, so even that was noticeable to me. In my eyes, my dad had us in his 50s, so that was older to me, and yet your situation is really significant. I wonder, did they ever talk about how they met, or do people ask you about that? Does it feel like a distant memory at this point? And I don't know, it's interesting.
Well, think about this. That was the early 60s. And so I don't know if you ever watched Mad Men or you kind of look back on that period of time. At that time,
he was episodes.
He was a suave, debonair entrepreneur, doctor, author, professional gambler. He had a title. He was the Count of Monte Carlo. He wrote books as the Count of Monte Carlo, gambling books. He was an inventor, a mathematician. He did all these, a musician. He was like that guy. And here she is, 18 years old, 17 years old, whatever, ran away from home because she had a horrible situation. And then she falls in the lap of this guy, and she's, like the secretary at his company. And that's that. What happened, you can guess what happens when you got a, late 50s playboy and a young, impressionable teenage woman. I could see what could happen back in the 60s, innocent time,
That's really, really interesting. And here you are, the product of that relationship. So, how interesting. Well, thank you for sharing. I mean, I can talk to you about that the whole hour, but I guess we won't. Guess we will keep going forward. But I'm sorry that you felt, that your sister was the one that you mainly resonated with. And yet I'm sure that is relatable to people, to people listening. I mean, a lot of people feel closest to their sibling. So can you walk us through, as you get older, what it was like grieving your dad with your sister and through the timeline of her own cancer diagnosis?
Well, sure. And you've talked about, and your listeners understand, like kind of watching somebody die is a different experience than when somebody's taken away from you, because it gives you the opportunity to kind of help both sides through that journey of what's going to come, right? You could talk about a lot of things. You're given the luxury of kind of wrapping your brain around what's happening. And although it doesn't make it easy, it does make it easier than, say, the regret that comes with somebody that was snatched away right away. And then you go, oh my gosh, I never got to say I love you, or, the last time we talked was a fight, or I had no idea on how to prepare them for end of life issues because I didn't expect them to die. I mean, there's a whole host of things, right? And so I honestly, I know this is going to sound cold, but I didn't necessarily grieve my dad only because I felt like I kept him at such a distance, and that was probably more my fault than his. But I kept him at such a distance when I was a kid because I was so angry that he was so old, you know? And I don't think I had the maturity to be able to accept that. And so when he did die, I kind of expected it because he was really old and he had been sick for a long time. So I kind of expected that he would die at some point. But I did have a great sense of compassion for my sister over that because my sister and him were very, very close. I kind of left home at 18 and went off on my own. Ended up, my car broke down in Vegas and I stayed there for 5 years before heading back to LA. And I kind of grew up,
Amazing.
yeah, on my own a little bit. She stayed close to my dad and really took care of him a lot as she was a couple years older than me. So through her early and mid 20s, she took care of him on a pretty regular basis. In fact, they were very, very close, talked to each other all day, every day. And he actually ended up dying while they were on the phone together. He had a massive stroke and died while they were on the phone. And she took his loss really tough. It was really hard for her. And I had a lot of compassion for that. So when she started going through the process of dying, which it was a process because she had terminal brain cancer. So it's a process, right? Like I don't know that your mom's cancer is terminal, but it's stage 4, most likely could be terminal. And there's a process to what she has to go through. And I think part of that process that my sister went through involved kind of reconciling the emotions over my dad.
That's interesting. It's interesting that you both had such different experiences, which, it's common, and it's good to highlight the differences that siblings have in relationship to their grief. What was it like when June was first diagnosed? Can you talk a little bit more about the early stages of her cancer and what advice you would have for other people who are first getting a diagnosis like that?
I didn't know it at the time, Chelsea, but I look back on it and go, in one sense, because I know you talk about the positives and the negatives, the lighter sides and the heavier sides. I'm not going to say thank goodness she got cancer, right? But one of the benefits of her getting cancer and the fact that it happened to her at a time when I was going through some ridiculous amounts of turmoil. I was in an abusive relationship. I had twins. I had to get them out of that situation. I was in a stressful job. I was an overweight smoker. I was having like all of these kind of like early midlife crises issues. Then all of a sudden she says, "Hey, guess what? I've got brain cancer and it's probably terminal." It gave me the opportunity to put the brakes on and go, whoa, wait a second. Maybe you ought to reassess things. And when she got the cancer and we started talking, it did give me the opportunity to make proactive purposeful changes in my life, just as a result of the fact that, you're kind of hitting the face with the shovel saying, holy crap, this shit, like you say, you're only going to die once. Yeah. Yeah. Like, she's going to die. So at some point I'm going to die. What the hell am I doing wasting my life? That was one part of it. Another part of it was that it gave us the opportunity to become closer and talk more. Now, that was probably her impetus, but my research and the reason I did this project was that most people don't do that. Most people, they're really good about caregiving, like the tasks around it. But when it comes to the emotional side, they kind of back off and they don't have the language. And I know you deal with a lot of younger people. They don't have the language to discuss emotions. They just don't, they don't know how to vocalize. They don't know how to process things. Their brains aren't developed enough, or they don't have enough safety or interaction enough to just let it out and even know how to get it out, right? But her and I started talking about all things kind of emotional and what it was going to be like for her to leave two young kids behind. How is it going to be for her husband? They were very close. Her friends, the regrets that she was going to have. And so her fear, those kind of things, we were able to talk about those things. And so that was another benefit of, what took her, was that it gave us the ability to get closer and talk about the emotional side of things.
And good for you for initiating and being a part of those conversations. I noticed, I'm glad you brought that up, because I was going to ask you, I saw in your literature about your book, it mentioned people are more comfortable with the tasks and the details of the cancer more so than they are addressing the emotional aspects. And I wondered what that has been like for you since embarking on these journeys and these triathlons publicly and writing this book. What have you encountered around that?
Yeah, so it kind of is the truth, right? Anybody, your listeners will be able to identify with this, right? Somebody has something traumatic happen to them, and you're like, oh my God, I got to bring them dinner. I got to cover for them at work. I got to see if they need help with the kids. I got to do this. I got to do that. That's if you're really close and if you have the kind of relationship where you can kind of help with the tasks, right? Drive them to chemo, help them navigate insurance, find them a lawyer. You can do these task things, but when it comes to, like, geez, you might die. How do you feel about that? Or, I'm going to watch you die. Do you want to know how I feel about that? Those are not conversations most people have. And when I saw that, like, I saw it as an observer, I did so June and I made a pact, okay, right before she died. She said, look, I'm going to do this. I don't know if you've heard or your listeners have heard of the Relay for Life that the American Cancer Society does, right? It's a 24-hour relay for life, blah, blah, blah. So she goes, hey, look, I'm going to go camping and I'm going to park myself in that tent and watch all of my team that's supporting me be out there for the whole 24 hours. And I said, okay, great. If you're going to do that in your condition, I'll run the whole 24 hours. Okay, so that was our pact. So I'll be there for her. She'll be there for everybody else.
How is that possible? So many questions, and yet that's awesome.
But she died 2 hours before, 2 days before. So 2 days before the relay, she passed away. But I still went and did the relay and did it with some friends, did it with my kids who were, at that time, they were 9. And that's when I first noticed that people were really open about talking. But then when it came to the remembrance lap, when it came to like kind of the heavier things, that it got dark, it got quiet, nobody talked. There were a lot of tears, but they weren't hugging tears. They were kind of silence tears and isolated things. And then once you were past that, then kind of people started talking again. And I went, why is that? Why are we not equipped to talk about the emotional side? And as I was doing these events year after year, and as I was kind of investigating this idea of maybe coming up with the idea for the book, as I talked to more people, that was a super common theme. Almost with everybody that I spoke to, was they hadn't processed the emotions, or if they had processed the emotions around the trauma, they hadn't communicated the processing of those emotions. So I've learned through this project that is a very common dynamic in people. Very common.
Absolutely. For better or worse. And, shout out to podcasts and books and all of these projects that can slowly normalize these things. I mean, I think if you've never said something out loud your entire life, that's awkward, and it's going to make you take pause before you elaborate. And because the infrastructure is not recommended at early ages, it's not discussed in school, in, death literacy, et cetera, it becomes extremely awkward, especially for those who have never experienced it themselves. So I'm, team normalize all of it, as I'm sure you are too. And the way to do that is one conversation at a time. So thank you for having the conversations and for raising awareness with the athletic events you're doing.
But I mean, listen, you've probably witnessed it, and I'm sure your listeners can identify with the fact that when you're 19 and you lose a parent, right? You've got a couple of close friends that you can hug and kiss, and they're gonna put their arm around you and take care of you. But everybody else, they kind of like they stand in the corner and point like, "Oh my God, I don't know what to say," or they kind of avoid you because they don't want to be an asshole and say the wrong thing. They're kind of like, oh my God, maybe she's being introverted. Maybe she wants me to leave her alone. Thank goodness, because I don't know what to say. I mean, there's a lot of isolation that goes along with it, and that just kind of propels our self isolation and our kind of like not willing and open to talk about the emotional side of it. So that was what was drawing me to do this project, was how can we better equip people to be able to start those hard conversations, because they're hard to have.
Absolutely. They are hard to have. I mean, they're hard to have sometimes even now, even after I've had so many, and I'm sure you've had so many, they can still present as challenging. And yet just being willing to, I always say like I always think like asking someone a question that's open-ended, like how are you feeling about something, is a good place to start, instead of are you okay? That elicits a yes or no, and it inspires you to want to say yes. What advice might you have for people who have never asked someone a question about their grief before? Is there a question you would recommend they start with?
Yeah, it's such a great question, and it's going to give away the ending of the book, because see, the book is 15 different stories, right? So
I love that. It's such a good idea.
I have a hard time identifying, like I like reading a book, that like one person's perspective on a topic, but when it comes to like the emotional, like life journey, whatever, I have a hard time identifying with one person's journey, because I kind of like to identify with them and see what kind of emotions are invoked in me through similarity or contrast. And when it's one person, it's just it just doesn't feel right. But when there's a cast of characters, then I go, oh, that's interesting to me. So when I did the book, I wanted to come up with like a ton of different people, age range, type of cancer range, one and done cancer, 5 times cancer. I wanted survivor, caregiver, professional, somebody who just encountered cancer a year ago, somebody who's been dealing with cancer for 40 years as an oncologist, whatever. I wanted range of emotion, people that were horrified by the cancer, people that were grateful for the cancer, everything. So what I did was I said, when you encounter cancer as point A, today is point B. But prior to A, you had a shit ton of traumas in your life, right? A drug addiction, suicide, abandonment, bad choices, abuse, whatever. How did those traumas affect your ability or inability to deal with the emotions of the trauma of cancer? Okay. The reason I tell you that is because those are the 15 stories. In between each of the stories is a short narrative where I talk about kind of my sister and my family and what it's like to lose a sibling. I talk a little bit about the people I met along the way, and I talk about the lessons learned, and not in a prescriptive kind of preachy way, but more just a storytelling way. And then at the end, I kind of say, hey, what's the biggest lesson that I learned? And it goes to answer your question. Long answer to a question, but goes to answer your question, which is I'm not really one for trying to give advice, but I'm hoping if you tell a story, somebody might be able to learn from it. So I'll tell you how I answer that question. I'm on the very last day of a 45-day, 4,700-mile bike ride.
Oh my goodness. That's amazing.
And what I wanted to do is connect the people that I've been talking to on the phone for the last couple of years through connecting them through my bike ride. That would be the thread that kind of binds those stories together. So I'm on the very last day. I got to go across the George Washington Bridge to get into Central Park, and then I'm going to go to Central Park and get to the finish line. It's a solo ride, my own finish line. And I don't know which way to go once I get across the bridge. I see these cyclists, okay? And there's two cyclists. They're talking. I stop and I want to ask them directions. Okay, so I kind of get their attention. One of them rides off, and this woman, she says to me, "Oh, hey, what are you doing?" And I go, "Oh, yeah, I'm on a bike ride. I'm almost done. I'm going to finish at Central Park. How do I get across and do this and do that?" She goes, "Oh," and she sees this little logo on my arm for Stupid Cancer. She goes, "Oh, Stupid Cancer. You doing like some kind of a charity ride or something?" And I go, "Yeah, I'm just finishing up. I came here from California." And she goes, "Oh my God, no way. Is it to raise money for cancer?" And I go, "Yeah." And then I told her about the book a little bit. And she said, "Oh my God, that's so great." She goes, "I lost my dad to cancer 4 years ago." And normally, Chelsea, I would have said, "Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry to hear that." So anyway, how do I get to wherever I'm going? Right? Because I wouldn't want to impose. She's a stranger. What the hell am I going to do asking her questions? Right? But everything that I learned from the couple of years that I was involved with this project was to do exactly what you suggested. And I said to her, I go, "Oh my gosh, what was he like?" Open ended question. And she goes, "Ah, oh, he was the greatest. That's why I cycle today. We would go cycling all the time. And he couldn't always, but in between treatment or whatever, we even took trips around the world and we cycled everywhere. He was the greatest guy ever." And I'm like, "Oh my God, that's fantastic." And she goes, "Oh my God, can I tell you a story?" I go, "Yeah, tell me a story." And she goes, "Well, his favorite cycling shirt had ice cream cones all over it. And as a joke, to get his cycling friends and family to smile, he asked when we did the wake if we would put him in his cycling shirt so that everybody could see him in his favorite cycling shirt with ice cream cones." And I went, "Oh my
Amazing.
God, that's hilarious." And she goes, "Yeah, every time I grab an ice cream, every time I see an ice cream cone, I think about my dad and cycling. And I'm so grateful and blah, 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 blah." And I said, "Oh my God, that's so great. How do I get to where I'm going? Thank you for sharing, blah, blah, blah." And we drove off. Now, listen, I'm never going to run into that woman ever again, right? But I'll never not think of her dad in a split second whenever it comes to ice creams or bike jerseys or whatever. And it's like, how lucky am I that a stranger was able to find a minute's comfort in telling another stranger that cared to ask about her dad that died a few years ago to tell a story. And, I mean, that was a gift that she gave to me, but it's also, I feel like I learned not just to say, "Oh, I'm sorry," and then back away. It was like what you said, to ask that open ended question. I would say, if you can, even though it might not be comfortable, even though you might think you're entering somebody's personal space, kind of like, "Oh, were you close? Oh, what was she like? Oh, how long ago was that?" Whatever. Any kind of
Mhm.
open ended question to begin a conversation to allow a safe place for two people to make a more meaningful and authentic connection. That's what I think life's all about.
I love that. And I love the specificity of the ice cream cones. And it's kind of a cool thing to think about the fact that you might have shared something with a stranger at one point who is perhaps still thinking about the conversation that you had too. That's kind of like a nice thing that I think I hadn't really thought about before. I'm like, hey, maybe I told a stranger something once about my dad. Maybe they remember it just like you do. So that's pretty cool. And yeah, the open ended question. What, I mean, in general, I feel like that could be taught in kindergarten, right? Why don't we ask people open ended questions in general? I think the world would be a better place. So it starts with you, right? It starts with me. It starts with how do we make this less awkward? Well, you being the one to go for it is a way to do that. So I'm glad that you have. That's good to hear.
Yes, but you also have to have the skill of listening too, because look, we don't always have the time to listen, nor do we always have the interest to listen. But if you can make the time, and if you do have the interest and are really, like I said, authentic and real and centered about it, then asking an open ended question allows you to listen. And when I feel that when people are trying to talk about emotional things, all they want to do that in is a place of safety and a place where they know that the person talking that they're talking to is not going through the motions, is not like kind of halfway checked out, right? If
Hmm.
you're authentically listening, I think that's really a gift to give to somebody is I'm only asking because I really want to know. And to give somebody the safety to know that you care to hear their thoughts or their vision about what they went through or how the emotional effects of the trauma hit them at that particular time or whatever, to want to listen to that, I think is giving that person something that they probably need.
That's a really good point about people wanting to share in a space where they know that someone's going to be listening intently. And that's a good point about not everyone has the skills or the interests, but I just forget that. I'm like, how could you not be interested in hearing about someone? And yet people are complicated, right? So maybe they are, but they're not, but they, they don't feel that people listen to them. So why should they listen to someone else? So many deep rooted things. So that's really interesting.
Can I just interrupt you just for one thing? I was just thinking, you made me think about one of my book participants. She's a 40-year oncologist at NYU. Now, when I first encountered her, I thought to myself, well, geez, this woman's been through so much. I can imagine what she went through trying to become a doctor as a woman, a surgeon as a woman, oncologist as a woman, just becoming an oncologist, to stay an oncologist for 40 years. What did she learn? Blah, 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 blah. And I'm thinking, man, I got to tap into this woman's knowledge and her ability. And I kind of set myself up to ask her tough questions, because I said to her, I said, Dr. Myers, I said, I'd like to be able to ask you things that you haven't talked about with other people. And she goes, well, you mean like the emotional stuff? I go, yeah. She goes, okay, well, I've never talked to anybody about it. Not my husband, not my coworkers, not my peers, not nobody. And I went, really?
What?
So I had assumed that here is this wonderful doctor who's very committed to the wellness community, very committed to advocacy groups. She's a very compassionate doctor, a very compassionate oncologist. And yet she had never, ever talked about the emotional issues around being an oncologist for 40 years. And also the emotional trauma left over from when she was 12 years old, her dad abandoned the family, never to be heard from again. And I thought to myself, if this woman hasn't talked about it, I mean, I just assume that everybody's equipped to talk about these things. I was constantly blown away when I would ask that question of people, hey, we got to be willing to go wherever you might not have gone before. All of them were like, yeah, that's fine. I don't talk about this stuff. We don't talk about that emotional side of it.
Right. That is so interesting, right? Like the oncologist who's dedicated her life to saving others and yet has not addressed her own emotional things, and not for lack of maybe even trying or wanting to, but like maybe just nobody has asked. So thank you for asking her and for sharing that anecdote here. It's really, really interesting.
Yeah, I'll tell you another super quick story, Chelsea. You just figure people are going to figure it out, right? Like we just know what the right thing to do is, but I don't think we do. One of the other book participants, Bobby, his story is about finding love after losing the love of your life. So he lost the love of his life to cancer very quickly after they got married, which was pretty quickly after they met. A very tragic story about they both kind of finally found love, and then they both had to deal with the fact that she was going to die. And then the story is really about finding love after that. But there was one story he told me that I thought was just fascinating, and that was that his father had a childhood friend who he talked to kind of every day for the last 50 years. And that childhood friend, his wife recently died of cancer. So Bobby says to his dad, hey, how's so-and-so doing? And the dad's like, I don't know, man. I haven't talked to him. He's like, what do you mean you haven't talked to him? He goes, what the hell do I say? His wife just died. And Bobby's like, he's your best friend. He goes, I know, but I don't want to like invade his space. I don't want to make him feel bad about it. Like, I don't know what to say. I'm just not going to call him. And Bobby's like, you know, he's sitting there going, why the hell is my best friend not calling me? Call him up and ask him, have you watched the Dodgers? What are you having for dinner? Right? Do you need help cleaning out your wife's closet? Whatever. It doesn't matter what you say. Just call and start talking to him. And it's like, it's so easy to not, right?
That is a really interesting story. It's like, oh, I'm doing them a favor by not calling, but also, no, you're not. Like, please call them. Please, anyone listening, call them. But it's understandable. I'm sure it happens all the time, And it's all the things that we're talking about. Even at the grief camp that I just did, the first night before the kids come, everyone introduces themselves. Like, what inspired you to come here? And I've done different grief camps, and I've been doing this for a few years now. So I'm like, okay, hi, I'm Chelsea. My dad died of ALS when I was 19. He had it since I was 4, blah, blah, blah. Like, happy to be here. I've done grief camp before. Like whatever I said. Okay, the majority of people, there's maybe 80 volunteers or so, did not address who they were honoring, or if they said my mom died, they didn't say how or when or anything. And I thought, this is a grief camp. We're about to support grieving kids and teens who are going to tell us the details of their parents' cancer, suicides, etc. And we are still feeling an awkward tension about sharing why we're here. I mean, perfect example. Wonderful program, nothing but good things to say. But I was like, okay, if I was in charge, I would require it because we're here. This is what we're doing. There's no shame. There's no stigma. I mean, and yet there is. There is forever and ever in all these situations. So I hope, wait, did the guy, to bring it back to you, thanks for letting me share there for a second. Did the best friend ever call?
Yeah, he
Did we
made his
ever
dad
know?
call him. He goes, hang up the phone
Okay,
and call
good.
your friend. Don't be a
Okay,
jerk.
great.
Call him. Right?
Love that. Thank goodness. Thank goodness. Okay, that's so interesting. How do we make this all less awkward? Well, I guess we just keep going. We
Look,
just
so
keep talking about
and
it.
I had a friend. Okay, that would be an exaggeration. I had an acquaintance. So
Mhm.
I was my day job's in finance. At one point, I was managing an office that had this guy in it. He and I were quasi friends while we were working together, and I came across a post that he made on social media or something, and I commented on it like, "Hey, how's it going? I haven't talked to you in a few years." He just says, "Oh my God, it's a rough time. We found out a couple of months ago that Nina has cancer and she died, and my kids are going off to college, and it's been really tough, and I don't know what to do about it." And before I embarked on this project, I might have not returned the note. First of all, we weren't that close. Second of all, what the hell do you say to that? Right? I mean, a
Mhm.
guy I really don't know that well, but I kind of remember the fact that all he cared about was his wife and kids. Just told me that his wife suddenly died and his kids are going off to college. And instead of that, I sent him a note saying, "I'd love to talk to you at some point. I hope you're doing well. I'm sure Nina would be proud that you're continuing to focus on the kids and send them to college. I hope you're doing well. Do you need anything? Is there, anything you want to talk about? Are friends abandoning you or are people close to you?" And I kind of just went through this whole little diatribe. Now we've only talked a couple of times since, but I thought
Mhm.
to myself, geez, there might have been a lot of his close friends that weren't willing or able to do that, or didn't know they could do that, didn't know they should do
Yeah.
that, right? And so I feel like that was something that was a gift for me through this process, was to learn the fact that it's okay to do that kind of stuff. In fact, you probably should when you can do that kind of stuff, because it just lets people know that other people care about them. Even if we don't understand, even if I couldn't be in your shoes, at least I care.
Well said. At least I care. And I like that what you said about, even only talking to him a few times. It's like those are a few times that could have really meant something to him. And it's a few times more than no times, right? I mean, we're not going to talk to every single person 30 times about their grief and loss if we're not close to them. But sometimes it is a handful of conversations. I had a coworker last year when I was at BuzzFeed. All the content I created was around grief, so it was very obvious that I had been through it. And if you look me up, it's out there for me. But within the course of a year, her dad didn't have cancer, then was diagnosed, then became terminally ill, then died. That was within 6 months. And we weren't like super close, but we were working together. And I, of course, reached out and of course was like, hey, let's, connect. And we've probably talked a handful of times. And yet they were great conversations. And I know she appreciated it. And she was like, I don't know who to talk to. And I was like, here's some resources, here's some books. And some people hate that. And some, she particularly asked. So, move forward there. But it's like sometimes we do talk to someone just a few times about it. But that's kind of beautiful. And it's kind of helpful more so than best friends to have like strangers and adjacent second, third level circles talk to you. You know what I mean? There's something kind of freeing about that because they don't know all your shit, like whereas your best friends do. So I think it's really cool that you did that.
Yeah, and I'm not doing it because I'm trying to be like, bragging about like, oh, I know what to do or what not to do. It's just that's what
Oh
I've
no, of
learned
course.
through talking to people is, like only 15 stories made the book, right? There were more that people I talked to, but maybe some of them we weren't able to get deep enough into their issues or pull enough out of them. But one of the more common themes amongst all of the 15 people was this sense of isolation. Either they self isolated or they were isolated because the important people in their lives exited their lives at the most important times that they needed to because they didn't know how to deal with it. Like this one guy, Joshua, imagine this, that he is literally going in for surgery to remove a grapefruit sized sarcoma from his stomach. He could die. He might not, but he could. And he's like this younger, macho, Puerto Rican guy who didn't really want to burden his girlfriend too much with the reality of what he was going through. But she goes to the hospital with him through pre surgery. And then, as you know, when you go in for any surgery, like every single person walks in and goes, so, we're taking out that tumor, right? And we're going to slice you open here, and that's on the left side of your stomach, and you could die, and blah, 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 right? Like, and you get like 30 people coming in to say, yeah, we're operating on your left finger. We're removing your left pinky, right? The left pinky, not the right one, the left one. Yes, yes, yes. That's why it says L on my hand, right? And then all of a sudden she looks at him, she goes, you didn't tell me it was this serious. I can't handle this. I'm out. And she walks out
Oh
pre-surgery.
my gosh, wait, that is the most awkward thing.
She's
That
like,
is
I
very
can't handle
awkward.
it. I can't. I don't want to be around somebody that's gonna die. Like this is not my life. This is not me. Can't handle it. I'm out.
That is extremely bizarre behavior. I mean, what a horrible
But
situation.
it is not rare behavior. Another book participant, Terry, she literally was expecting to get a drive to the hospital to check herself in for the first surgery pre her first bone marrow transplant. He doesn't show up. She jumps in a cab. She's on the way to the hospital. He calls her up and he says, yeah, Terry, I'm really not as strong as you. I can't handle that. And oh, by the way, I hate to tell you this, but I got somebody else pregnant and I'm going to stay with her this weekend. So you're on your own. And she's like,
Oh God.
I'm going to the hospital for surgery pre pre stem cell surgery. He's like, yeah, I'm sorry. I'm not strong enough. I can't be there for you. I
Well,
mean, these
sounds
are real life situations.
That sounds like he's not a good person in general based on what you just said. So I hope that she dodged a major bullet there, but that sounds really stressful. I cannot imagine, of course.
But those are extreme examples. But I think isolation, either self-imposed or by people leaving you, because right, a lot of people shut in because they don't want to people feel guilty. They'll keep it to themselves because they don't want to burden people. But self-isolation or being isolated by examples like what I just gave you, that's a very common theme.
Absolutely. Well, I'm so glad you shared some of the tidbits here. People will have to listen and get on board with all 15 because what interesting stories for sure. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about your physical endurance here. And I wonder if you could talk about what it was like biking 5,000 miles across the country and what you have learned from that and similar bike rides since.
Sure. Oh boy. So what do you do besides meditation and yoga for your brain? Like what do you do?
Not that, but it sounds really interesting. I wish I could say more about that. Yeah, I mean, walks, physicality, yoga, all of that is important, and therapy. What about you? You tell me.
So for me, and I don't know if people can identify with this or not. For me, like a yoga is great. Talking to a therapist for an hour is great. Taking a walk is great. But it takes me a while to kind of unwind and clear my brain enough so that I can, in a very Zen way, deal with issues in my head, right? Like we all have to kind of put the fire out when we need to, right? Throughout our lives, throughout our days, we're always constantly putting out fires. But from taking from a calm, kind of grounded Zen way, how we deal with the problems or the issues at hand. And for me, that happens through endurance athletics. So if I'm out on a hour run, I feel pretty good when I get back. But when I'm out on like a 4 hour run, I've kind of solved some problems by the time I get back. So I feel really good. Maybe more physically tired, but mentally or emotional, psychologically better. It's kind of like when you run into somebody they haven't seen in years for lunch, you feel really good. But when they come over and they stay at your house for a weekend because you haven't seen them in 10 years, I mean, man, you really get it all, right? You get it all. For me, endurance athletics is that kind of place to solve problems and kind of tackle issues and really wrap your brain around the things that are important. So when I embarked on this bike ride, I had hoped to reinforce this idea of, by meeting people, how we don't talk about the emotions around cancer, which was reinforced every day, all day. I also wanted to give myself a time to grieve my sister. And I know you've talked about, and we talked about it earlier, when's the right amount of time? Do you do it right away? Do you wait 10, 20, 30 years? Whatever. For me, grief happened, about 10 years later. I was ready to deal with it. And then I wanted to, like I said earlier, tie the stories together through this narrative of the bike ride. And so every day I was on my bike between about 8 and 17 hours, depending on the wind and flat tires and if I got lost or how many hills there were or whatever. And I was biking 41 out of 45 days. So I did not have very much time to recoup each day.
Wow.
And it was really brutal physically, like really brutal. But it was also quite challenging. And I learned a ton. Like I learned that when you have to rely on other people, it's totally great that you do rely on them and you should be grateful for it, that people want to help you, which was a big lesson for me because I didn't like to let people help me. Then I was reinforced that when I didn't have people to help me, I had to figure out a way to freaking deal with the issue because there's nobody there. So what do? You figure it out. So I feel like I was able to reinforce that I could be as resilient as possible, but also reinforce that when I needed help, I was lucky enough to be able to lean on people. I think you can learn that you can push yourself more than you ever could imagine. And I think if you're trying to do anything meaningful, it's kind of cool that other people find some inspiration in that. So it was really cool. I don't want to talk about it because I didn't want to sound like I was bragging, but then when I did talk about it, it opened up people to tell me a story or to tell me something about their life or to be like, oh my God, that's incredible. Right. And it kind of inspired them a little bit. So that was pretty cool to be able to experience that. So I learned a ton. Chelsea.
That's really, really fascinating. I don't know that I've talked to anyone who's gone on such a long bike ride before, much less multiple. So thank you for what you're doing and for inspiring us / stressing us. I mean, encouraging us to get out and get that 5K going, if nothing else. It's just interesting. It's like, I've never ran a 5K. Why not? Why haven't we all? I don't know. Some people just have it. So it's really cool that you have and that you started in your late 30s after being a smoker, right? Did people ask you about that a lot? Like, how did you get started and what was it like quitting smoking and stuff? Because I think that's a really interesting piece here, like we had said before.
Yeah, so I had heard about 1,000,000 times to stop smoking, right? Advertisements, things in the movies, friends, whatever. You tell yourself 100 times you should quit smoking, but I didn't really hear it till I heard it, right? And I heard it from my daughter. I had twins, and she was like, they were just before they were 5, and she knew that my sister was dying of cancer, right? Because I was very open with my kids. And then she had heard from her kindergarten teacher that smoking causes cancer. So she put 2 and 2 together as a 5-year-old brain would and said, hey, I don't want you to die. Can you quit smoking? I said, yeah, sure. But could you do me a favor and stop sucking your thumb? Because, maybe you should do that. And so we made a pact. She stopped sucking her thumb. I stopped smoking. But I didn't really hear it until I heard it. And then I said, well, shit, I don't want to quit at quitting. I feel like that's a crutch. If you quit at quitting one time, if you say, I'm going to stop X, and then you don't stop X, the second time it gives you a little less resistance, right? If you are okay with failing at something 5 times or 10 times, you're going to be okay failing at it another 5 or 10 times easily. But if you don't give yourself the opportunity to fail, kind of like tightrope walkers, if they got a net, they're probably going to fall. If they don't have a net, man, there's no way they're going to fall. So I thought to myself, if I start running, if I start swimming, I can't keep smoking. So I just put two and two together and said, I can't smoke while I'm in the water swimming. I can't smoke while I'm running. So I might as well run and swim and then bike because it will prevent me from smoking. And so that's why I said I was not strong enough to sit around all day and not smoke. I had to go do something else.
Good for you. And how are you feeling now? How do you feel in your body? Do you feel the best you've ever felt? Like how are you feeling day to day?
I mean, that's a lot of years. I'm part of a lot of different groups and I do some talking and I don't do a podcast, but I do a show for 40 plus athletes and I hear a lot of people go, "Oh, I'm in the best shape of my life," or whatever, and they're 60 years old, and I go, "No, you're not in the best shape of your life. I mean, you might feel like you're healthy, but you're not in the best shape of your life, right?" I know that you say, I mean, it was either you or one of your guests said the right time to do something is 5 years ago.
Oh yeah, I said that. Yeah, yeah.
Right. You were in better shape 5 years ago, trust me. I mean,
Right.
really. But it's nice to know that you feel really healthy. So I can tell you at my age, I feel really healthy. I see a lot of people my age complain like their best days are behind them. I'm still looking forward to the next Ironman and the next big event I'm going to do and trying to look and feel better. So as long as I'm believing that I'm still on an upward path, then that's pretty cool. So I feel awesome about it that I can go out and do an Ironman or, go for a 6 hour hike or plan some 5,000 mile bike ride and still feel like it's ahead of me, not behind me. So in that sense, I feel great.
That is amazing. And I appreciate the honesty. And it's so cool. And it's so important to have milestones to look forward to at all ages. That's what keeps us going. And if you don't have one right now, it's like, ask yourself, why not? And what could I have? And what could I plan? And if you feel like you've done everything, like, what's that about? And I love like being in touch, like what could be next and how. So I love that you found this. It's really inspiring, especially the late 30s aspect. I know I said that like five times, but I just think that's so cool. Because it's like, everyone's like, well, since I was 5, I've, trained this. And you're like, well, I'm 40 years behind or not. I mean, I'm not 45, but you get what I mean. So it's
And I
awesome.
got nothing in common with those people. And the thing that, like, there's one of the founders of Ironman. He said a quote that just never left me. He said, "When I step up to that start line, I might not finish first. I might not finish last, but I'm going to finish ahead of the guy that never started. And if I quit, nobody's going to care. Like, nobody's even going to notice that I quit, but I'm always going to know." And I went, well, that makes pretty good sense to know that nobody really cares, nobody's watching. So it's just a matter of you wanting to do it because you're always going to know. And so I kind of think like that whole idea of what can I find out about myself? What can I accomplish? Where I'm just doing it to figure out what I can do. I'm not doing it to impress. I'm not doing it so I can point to a medal. I'm not doing it to put a picture of myself crossing the finish line at the living room so everybody can brag about me. It's not that. It's like, oh, I wonder what I can do. And that's kind of cool. It's really a motivator for me. And like I said just a minute ago, it's only because I believe that as long as I can, I'm going to believe my best days are ahead of me.
Love that, David. Something I normally ask people at the beginning of the pod, I'm going to ask you at the end, is about your goldfish moment. That was the first time you thought about or conceptualized death in some way. For some people, it was a goldfish. You mentioned your dad. Do you feel like that was the influence, or is there another death in your childhood that comes to mind? Goldfish moment. Did your goldfish die? Goldfish moment. Did it make you cry?
No, I've had deaths in my childhood that were traumatic, a little more traumatic than others, but I don't think that it ever affected me in a way where I became aware of it in as meaningful a way as when my dad died. Now, I know that's not the first one because I was 22 years old. So, there were other stories and other deaths that that affected me, but I don't know that I became aware of kind of the finality of death and kind of the paradox of that whole you're here one moment, you're gone the next, and what did you do in your life, and does it really matter or whatever. And I had just recently, if I can bore you with a not such a quick answer, when my dad was close to death, few years before he died, one of his brothers, who I had only met once or twice before, my Uncle Bob, was dying of emphysema. And he had looked me up in Vegas. I was in my very early 20s. And he had looked up all of his relatives to want to like make a parting shot with them or whatever. So he sat down and he told me all this fantastical stuff about my dad. Okay. These kind of like, no way this happened to one person, right? Stuff. All the things he accomplished, which were just amazing things. And I was equally as inspired and awestruck as I was angry, because how come I didn't know it? And how come I wasn't around to watch him do all this stuff, right? Why did he have to get old before he had me? And so it was kind of this dichotomy. But when he died and I went to the funeral, I was shocked at how few people were there. And I went, what the hell, man? This was a guy who had these stories are just unbelievable, crazy stories of all the people that he impacted and all the companies he ran, and musician and writing books and just being an entrepreneur and all this stuff. And meanwhile, there was like 12 people at his funeral. And I went, that is telling. Like, oh, I gotta learn from that. I gotta take something from that. So I think the first time that I really was impacted by a death was that thought of, I got to figure out a way to maybe have more people at my funeral.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And I feel like you have done that. You've done just that, right? All of your people in your book participants and the people that you do all of your triathlons with and all of these things. So that's really cool that you have made meaning out of this experience. David, where can people find your book online? Where can they connect with you and learn more about the awesome work that you're doing?
Thanks, Chelsea. Well, the 100% of the proceeds from the book go to support the different cancer-focused charities that were chosen by the book participants. So inside the book, on my website, it's listed, it's American Cancer Society, the Moffitt Cancer Center in Florida, Children's Hospital LA, a bunch of other ones. So any dollar that comes in from sales of books gets distributed amongst those charities. So they can buy the book on my website. They can go to Amazon, where most books are sold, and the book is called Cycle of Lives. I think it's a good book. It's easy to read. It's 400 pages, but it's easy to read because it's a bunch of short stories, and all the stories are first person, so they're told from that person's perspective, not mine. So you won't get bored by the voice. And they can go to cycleoflives.org, or they can go to Amazon and buy the book, and hopefully not only know that they're raising a little bit of money for charity, but also maybe become better equipped to understand what people might be going through.
I love that so much. I really appreciate getting to hear more about this, David, and congrats on what you're doing and for raising money and for having June's legacy live on through these beautiful things. It's super incredible. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks. And thank you for the time. And I appreciate your interest. And we'll stay connected, and I will continue to listen to your crazy podcast.
Thank you so much. No pressure. Yodo, you only die once.